For this 68-year-old veteran, his flag wasn't just cloth on a pole, it was a lifetime of sacrifice. But when his HOA called it illegal and fined him every single day, he refused to back down. What started as one-man stand turned into a fight that captured the nation's attention. For most people, a front yard is just a patch of grass, maybe a garden bed, or a spot to park the family car. But for Daniel Hayes, a 68-year-old veteran, his front yard had a greater purpose. It was where he chose to raise the flag every morning, a ritual he had carried with him since the day he came home from Vietnam decades earlier. The motion was simple. Walk to the flagpole, untie the rope, and let the stars and stripes climb into the sky with the rising sun. For Daniel, it wasn't just about patriotism. It was about honoring fallen comrades, honoring his late wife who always watched with pride, and reminding himself that his service still had meaning long after the war ended. The pole itself was unremarkable, 20 feet of sturdy aluminum, planted firmly in concrete at the edge of his driveway. To Daniel, it was a modest memorial. To his neighbors, it was simply part of the landscape. For a while, no one said anything, until the day a letter arrived in his mailbox stamped with the HOA seal. The notice was blunt. His flagpole was unauthorized, and unless he removed it within 10 days, he would be fined. There were no complaints about noise, no issues with property lines, just a claim that the flagpole violated aesthetic guidelines. Daniel read the letter 3 times, his hands tightening with each pass. Of all the battles he had faced in his life, he never imagined that one would involve the flag he had fought under. But deep down, he knew this wasn't about paperwork or guidelines. It was about principle. He refused to take it down. The HOA's response was swift. Another letter came, this time with the threat of fines $50 a day until the pole was removed. Daniel looked up at the flag fluttering in the breeze and made a decision. No matter how many fines came, the pole wasn't going anywhere. That's when the real war began. The first fine was almost laughable. $50 for the crime of raising a flag in his own yard. Daniel tossed the letter in a drawer, more annoyed than alarmed. But the next day brought another, and the next, until the stack grew like a paper mountain. By the end of the first month, the HOA claimed he owed $1,500. Neighbors started to take notice. A few would shake their heads sympathetically when they saw him outside, murmuring things like, "Hang in there." Others muttered that he was stirring up trouble. But Daniel didn't waver. He had faced worse than angry neighbors and bureaucratic threats. The HOA president, a woman named Marjorie Ellis, took a personal interest in the matter. With her sharp suit's clipped tone and an almost religious devotion to the rulebook, she embodied every caricature of an HOA Karen. To her, Daniel's flagpole wasn't just a violation, it was a challenge to her authority, and she intended to win. As the fines accumulated, the tone of the letters grew more aggressive. They warned of liens against his property, threats of legal action, and further consequences if he refused to comply. Daniel began keeping every notice, sliding them into a binder he labeled HOA War. Still, every morning he stepped outside, tied the rope, and let the flag rise. Each day the fines piled up, but so did his resolve. For him, the flag wasn't negotiable. It was the last promise he had made to himself, and no HOA president was going to break it. By the second month, the fines had surpassed $3,000. That's when Marjorie escalated further, sending board members to his home to remind him of the rules. Daniel stood his ground, calm but unyielding. What Marjorie didn't realize was that every step she took to pressure him was only building his case. The HOA thought they were bleeding him dry with paper and threats. But Daniel was preparing for a battle much bigger than his front yard. As the weeks passed, Daniel's quiet act of defiance transformed the entire neighborhood into a battlefield of opinions. Every time the flag caught the sunlight, neighbors saw more than fabric. They saw a dividing line. On one side, there were those who admired Daniel's resolve. They remembered his service, the stories he had told about the jungles of Vietnam, and the sacrifices his generation made. For them, the flag wasn't just his, it was a shared symbol of resilience. Some began leaving baked goods at his door, handwritten notes that said things like, "We stand with you." But not everyone felt the same. Others, led by Marjorie's constant whisper campaign, argued that Daniel's defiance was reckless. They muttered about property values, rising legal fees, and the danger of making the HOA look weak. Some avoided eye contact when they passed his house, while others openly criticized him at board meetings. The tension wasn't limited to the street. At neighborhood gatherings, hushed arguments broke out. Families who had once barbecued together now stood on opposite sides of the lawn. What had once been a quiet, tightly controlled community was beginning to fracture under the weight of one man's flagpole. Daniel remained calm through it all. Every morning he raised the flag as he always had. Every evening, he lowered it and folded it with the same precision he had learned as a young soldier. He never shouted, never lashed out. He let the flag speak for him, but the conflict was impossible to ignore. Cars began to slow down as they passed his property. Strangers stopped to take photos. Word was spreading beyond the community, and Marjorie's carefully crafted authority was slipping through her fingers. The HOA had intended to bury Daniel under fines and pressure, but instead they had created a spectacle. And like all spectacles, it was only a matter of time before someone with a camera turned it into news. The first sign came as a folded newspaper tossed onto Daniel's driveway. On the front page of the local section was a headline, "Veteran Fined for Flying American Flag." The article was only a few paragraphs long, but it carried a sting the HOA never expected. By the next morning, local reporters were parked on the street. Cameras pointed at his house. Microphones were extended toward his porch. The story had struck a chord. What kind of community punished a veteran for raising his country's flag? Daniel didn't seek the spotlight, but he didn't shy away from it either. When asked why he refused to take down the pole, he answered simply, "Because some things are worth standing for." His quiet words carried more power than any shouting match ever could. The HOA scrambled to control the narrative. Marjorie released a statement claiming the board was only enforcing the rules equally for all residents, but the damage was done. The story had already gone viral online, with strangers across the country commenting in outrage. Support began pouring in. Veterans groups reached out, offering legal help. Neighbors who had remained silent before now joined Daniel openly, standing in his yard as the cameras rolled. Cars drove by with flags waving out their windows, honking in support. The attention terrified the HOA. What had once been a quiet dispute behind closed doors had exploded into a public relations nightmare. The fines, the threats, the paperwork, all of it looked small and petty compared to the sight of an aging veteran standing proudly by his flag while the nation watched. Daniel hadn't asked for this, but he welcomed it. For the first time, he realized this fight was no longer about him alone. His stand had become a symbol for anyone who had ever been pushed around by those in power, and the louder the media amplified his story, the more desperate Marjorie became. Public opinion was turning sharply against the HOA, but instead of backing off, Marjorie and her board went on the offensive. If anything, the media pressure made them more combative, desperate to reassert their authority. A new wave of notices hit Daniel's mailbox. This time the language was harsher. Threats of liens, property seizure, and legal action if the unauthorized structure was not removed immediately. The daily fines now totaled over $10,000, a sum the board gleefully waved around during meetings as proof of his defiance. Behind closed doors, the HOA was unraveling. Some board members questioned Marjorie's obsession. Others worried about the costs of prolonged legal battles. But Marjorie refused to bend. For her, this wasn't just about a flagpole, it was about dominance. If Daniel won, she feared the entire HOA would lose its grip on the neighborhood. The tension bled into the streets. Daniel's supporters placed small flags in their own yards, a quiet protest that spread from house to house. Within a week, dozens of flags lined the neighborhood, turning the HOA's uniform community into a patchwork of patriotism. Marjorie saw it as an act of rebellion. Daniel saw it as solidarity. At the same time, donations began arriving in his mailbox from strangers across the country. Handwritten notes tucked with $20 bills, messages from fellow veterans, and emails from families thanking him for standing his ground. The fight had grown far larger than one man and one HOA, but the board wasn't done yet. Marjorie convened an emergency session, where she pushed through a vote to hire outside legal counsel. Their plan was simple: drag Daniel into court, drown him in legal fees, and hope the pressure broke him. Daniel didn't flinch. He had faced far greater enemies than a rule book and a boardroom full of petty tyrants. He gathered every notice, every threat, every letter of support, and prepared for the next phase of the battle. The HOA thought they were tightening the noose. In reality, they were walking straight into the spotlight of a courtroom where their authority would finally be tested. The day of the court hearing felt like a turning point, not just for Daniel, but for everyone watching. Cars lined the street outside the courthouse, many with miniature flags taped to their windows. Reporters clustered near the steps, cameras flashing. This was no longer a neighborhood squabble. It had become a national story. Inside, Daniel sat calmly beside his attorney, a veteran himself who had volunteered to represent him at a reduced fee. Across the aisle, Marjorie and the HOA's lawyers shuffled through thick binders of paperwork, their faces tight with nerves. The proceedings began with the HOA's argument. Their lawyer recited bylaws, regulations, and vague claims about aesthetic standards. They insisted the fines were valid, that rules must be upheld, and that the flagpole was never approved. Their words were long and technical, but their argument felt hollow. Then came Daniel's turn. His attorney laid out a simple, powerful case. Federal law explicitly protected the right to display the U.S. flag. The HOA's rules could not override that. Every notice, every fine, every threat was not only unfair, it was illegal. The courtroom fell silent as Daniel's lawyer presented the binder of evidence. Photographs of the flagpole, letters of support from neighbors, and even a statement from a veterans organization. He didn't need theatrics. The truth spoke for itself. The judge listened carefully, flipping through the documents. Finally, he leaned forward, his tone sharp but clear. The HOA had overstepped. The fines were invalid. The lien threats were baseless. And the flagpole was to remain untouched. Relief washed over Daniel as the gavel came down. But it wasn't just relief, it was vindication. All the threats, the stress, the sleepless nights had led to this moment. He had stood his ground and the law had stood with him. Behind him, quiet applause broke out in the courtroom. Neighbors who had once been divided were united in that moment. Not just by the flag, but by the truth that fairness had prevailed. Marjorie sat frozen, her face pale, her empire of control shattered in a single ruling. For the first time, she realized her authority wasn't absolute, and her obsession had cost the HOA far more than she ever imagined. But for Daniel, the fight wasn't just about winning. It was about proving that some battles are worth standing for, no matter the cost. When the judge declared the HOA's actions invalid, the courtroom seemed to exhale all at once. Applause broke out, cautious at first, then swelling until even the bailiff had to call for order. For Daniel, the sound wasn't noise, it was recognition. Recognition of a battle well fought, and of principles that still mattered. The ruling was straightforward. All fines levied against Daniel were null and void. The HOA was barred from interfering with his flagpole again, and in a final blow, the judge ordered the HOA to reimburse Daniel for his legal fees. It was more than a victory. It was a public rebuke of everything Marjorie had tried to enforce. Marjorie sat rigid, her eyes wide with disbelief. The authority she had wielded for years with sharp words and paper threats had evaporated in a single afternoon. Her attempt to make an example of Daniel had backfired spectacularly. Instead of humbling one man, she had humiliated herself and the board she led. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed. Daniel was calm, humble, almost understated in his words. He didn't gloat or point fingers. He simply said he was grateful for the ruling, for the support, and for the chance to keep raising the flag he loved. Reporters leaned in, hungry for sound bites, but Daniel gave them something better. Authenticity. The story spread like wildfire. National outlets picked it up. Talk shows debated the absurdity of an HOA trying to strip a veteran of his right to fly the flag. On social media, hashtags tied to Daniel's case trended for days. Videos of the flag waving in his yard racked up millions of views. But perhaps the most telling moment came not from strangers, but from his neighbors. One by one, families who had once kept their distance began planting small flagpoles of their own. What had started as a battle over one man's yard had become a movement across the neighborhood. For Daniel, the ruling wasn't the end. It was a reminder that sometimes standing firm against unreasonable power doesn't just protect yourself, it inspires others to do the same. In the weeks that followed, Daniel's quiet neighborhood became an unlikely landmark. Cars drove by just to see the flag that had sparked national debate. Veterans groups organized visits, saluting in his yard before shaking his hand. School children wrote him letters, thanking him for standing firm. What had once been a lonely fight now belonged to countless others who saw themselves in his story. The HOA, meanwhile, faced fallout of its own. Marjorie was pressured into resigning after an internal audit revealed not just her mishandling of Daniel's case, but a history of questionable decisions. The board was restructured, new leadership took over, and the climate of fear that had gripped the community began to dissolve. For Daniel, life returned to something resembling normalcy. Each morning he walked outside, tied the rope, and watched the flag climb into the sky. But now he wasn't alone. Neighbors often joined him, standing silently as the cloth unfurled, their presence a quiet acknowledgement of what had been won. The flagpole had been more than aluminum and concrete. It had been a test of will, of community, and of principle, and by standing tall, Daniel had shown that not all battles are fought on distant fields. Some are fought at home, against the creeping arrogance of small authorities who believe they can dictate the lives of others. One evening, as the sun set and the flag caught the golden light, Daniel thought of the friends he had lost in service. He thought of his wife, who had always believed in his quiet strength. And he realized something important. This fight had never just been about him. It had been about everyone who had ever been told to sit down, to give in, to obey without question. In the end, the flag still waved. Not because an HOA allowed it, but because one man refused to let it fall.